I want to start with a very simple idea, and it's one that may challenge the way that some of us think about vulnerabilities. We typically treat CVEs as the beginning, that's when something becomes real. That's when we begin to prioritize, and that's when we begin to act. What if that's already too late? Because the data we're collecting at GreyNoise is telling us that. Attackers are already probing, testing, and in some cases, exploiting vulnerabilities long before they're disclosed. At GreyNoise, we employ a global deception sensor grid, i.e. honeypots, that collects mass scanning activity across the globe, particularly focused on malicious cyber actors targeting edge devices, and we collect this in real time. And so with that collect, it led us down this path of trying to understand what happens before a CVE is disclosed. Are there measurable traces that malicious cyber actors leave behind, and can we act on those measurable traces from a proactive standpoint? And so it's no longer a question of are we responding in time, but are we actually starting at the right point in time? Oh, I think, gentlemen, oh, here we go, thank you. All right, so let me start with the problem. So it's an issue of a timing gap. Defenders operate on disclosure timelines, whereas offensive actors operate on discovery timelines. And I feel like I understand this very well. So in my past life, I was a US Air Force intelligence officer for 25 years. In my final duty position, I was the Director of Intelligence for Cyber National Mission Force. That is the offensive arm of the Department of Defense. And so I have a good idea on both the offensive and the defensive side. And I would submit to you that offensive malicious cyber actors have the advantage right now. They have the advantage of first mover advantage. And what that allows them to do is to seize the initiative and shape the battle space, putting defenders in completely reactive posture. This is particularly a problem for edge devices. So those devices that we rely on every single day, firewalls, VPNs, routers, they are under constant pressure. In fact, year over year, there's been an 8-time increase in reconnaissance and exploitation against these edge devices. And if you look at recent industry reporting from Google, Mandiant, or CrowdStrike, you can see the different figures of just how much targeting is taking place against these edge devices. Malicious cyber actors are targeting these edge devices because defenders lack visibility on those systems. There is no EDR for edge devices. The other thing I want to highlight is a CrowdStrike report that identified that 40% of the PRC intrusions occurred through edge devices. So from a United States perspective, that is our pacing threat. And it's a very real threat, particularly towards the Five Eyes community. So with this problem in mind, again, we had the idea that if bad actors are conducting reconnaissance and exploiting vulnerabilities ahead of disclosure, they should be leaving behind measurable traces of that. So we tested that. The first test we did was last summer in 2025. The bottom line of this test is that across 216 different spike events, and a spike event is a measurable increase in volume above the baseline. But across 216 spike events, in 50% of the times, a CVE followed in 3 weeks. And in 6 weeks, a CVE followed 80% of the time. So I got a couple different quick case studies you see up here, so I'll just orient you to the slide. But top left corner, just 2 case studies for Cisco and Citrix. The white dots were the particular spikes in reconnaissance and exploitation. The red dot is when the CVE dropped. So these are just 2 examples where we see malicious cyber actors conducting reconnaissance, potentially exploitation before CVE drops. Now, that 6-week model where 80% of the spikes that we saw happen within those 6 weeks, it didn't hold across all the vendors. You can see that towards the bottom. For Cisco, Citrix, and MikroTik, there were a number of spike events that occurred outside that 6-week window. But for the vendors there on the bottom right corner, that 6-week window held true. So that really made us start thinking of like, there's a potential early warning signal within this data. When we looked at this data, a key point to make is that it is based on IP-based sessions. So please keep that in mind. So again, we focused on internet-facing edge devices. That's where our deception network sits. Most of the spikes that we saw were real exploits. The majority of the activity leading up to CVEs, it was not generic scanning. It was exploit attempts against previously known vulnerabilities. And with regards to previously known vulnerabilities, I think it's also important for this audience to understand that within our data, the sheer volume of attacks that targeted vulnerabilities prior to 2015 outpaced every other time period. So those old vulnerabilities are still a persistent threat. All right, so then let's transition forward. The evolution of our analysis. So we looked at data starting in December, ending through March of this year. So about 103 days. We looked at just about 148 million sessions across 276 tags or behaviors that are associated with this activity across 18 different vendors. So we expanded the number of vendors from 8 to 18. And some things really stuck out to us. 50% of the surges preceded CVEs within 3 weeks. 50% of the surges preceded CVEs within 3 weeks. 49% within 10 days, and again, 78% within 21 days. So let me direct your attention to the graphic that you see up there. So the bright teal dots that you see are the spike activities that we observed with reconnaissance and exploitation data. The red diamond is when the CVE was disclosed. The line that ties between them is the lead time in which we had from understanding the behavior that a malicious cyber actor was exhibiting to the time that a CVE was dropped. And across all the different sessions we looked at, there was a median lead time of 11 days. That is a window in which defenders can prepare. They can brief leadership, they can stage patching, they can harden networks. It is a defined, measurable window in which defenders can act. So in the 2025 study I mentioned, we looked at IP-based sessions. In this study, we looked at session-based also, along with IP-based. And between those two, the strongest signal was actually the session-based. The session is really measuring the intensity of the signal, the volume of traffic, not the number of IPs that are coming across. But one of the very interesting things is when we saw sessions and IPs increase at the same time, so both volume and infrastructure increased at the same time, that spike to CVE pairing increased up to 71%. And that's way above chance. So we ran 10,000 permutations. Chance is 0.0015. This is way above chance. So the key thing to understand here is that the session is the strongest signal. You compare it with IP-based signals. That gives you a strong early warning signal. One of the very interesting things, and I'll go into some of the behaviors that we saw with this, but the higher severity vulnerabilities, those CVSs that were 10.0 and higher, actually had more early warning than some other vulnerabilities. And we'll dive into that now. So again, the most critical vulnerabilities receive the most advanced warning, sometimes up to 39 days. I highlighted a couple examples up there, Cisco, MikroTik, VMware. You can see the earliest signal and the latest signal, but the key thing to take away from this is that malicious cyber actors are spending more time against those potential targets that could reap them greater reward, either from an e-crime perspective or reap them a greater reward to achieve their national security objectives. So again, the earliest signals had the longest lead time. That's good news for defenders. Behavior patterns. So some of the different behaviors that we saw were, scanning, brute force, remote code execution, crawlers, file disclosures. Some of the things to keep in mind. The strongest, earliest signal is scanning. So you think about the life cycle of reconnaissance, exploitation, access. Scanning is the strongest signal. Remote code execution, if your SOC is identifying remote code execution, it is more than likely that you're about mid-stage within the attack cycle. When you begin to identify brute force activity, that's later stage. And you can see that in regards to the percentage of pairing and the average lead time with that. So scanning 12 days, remote code execution 9 days on average, and brute force activity 8 days on average. So again, this activity progresses from reconnaissance to exploitation to access attempts. Earlier signals provide more lead time. Later signals indicate how close we may be to a vulnerability disclosure. So now I want to compare 2025 and 2026. So the red line is 2025, the green line is 2026. And what you see in the difference there is that, again, the IP-based median in 2025 is 21 days. The IP-based median in 2026 was 13 days. I don't know why that decreased. We're trying to figure that out. There could be a number of different reasons on why that decreased. Either malicious cyber actors have foreknowledge of vulnerabilities, they're conducting research at the same time as other researchers, they're conducting reconnaissance of vulnerabilities, and vendors aren't disclosing it when they start identifying the activity. There's a number of different reasons. So I'd love to work with the community to try to identify why that change in the median. I'm confident it's not necessarily AI. So 2026, again, session-based. This is the strong signal. 11 days of median time, 49% of the pairings between vulnerability or CVE disclosures and spikes, and then sessions produce the fastest, most reliable warnings. We use 3 weeks as the statistical window because that's where the majority of the pairings fell. In the 2025 study, the majority of the pairings fell within 3 weeks, so it's actually condensed that timeline, and we'll talk a little bit more about timeline compression with a few case studies. So the 2026 study, we talked about two different signals, session-based, or session spikes, which means the intensity, and then IP spike, which is really the breadth of activity, the number of IP, the infrastructure that exists to make that happen. When you look at just the session spike, the pairing was 50%. If you look just the IP spike, it was 20%. But again, when you combine that activity, an increased volume of traffic, plus an increase in infrastructure above the baseline, that pairing of spike activity to CVE disclosure jumps up to 71%. It's a confidence booster. It's not a standalone signal. So as I'm describing this all to you, this is probabilistic, it's not deterministic, but it is a decision support tool that could provide up to 11 days for SOC defenders to brief their leadership, patch their networks, and harden their networks as well. So this was an interesting thing that we came across. So again, we looked at 18 different vendors across all the different edge devices that we mimic, and there were 2 vendors in particular that jumped out. And what we saw was a compression countdown. So what I mean by that is from that earliest signal to the last signal prior to the CVE being disclosed, we actually saw a countdown in days, from 39 days to 19 days to 10 days to 3 days. And in these 2 particular cases, it stood out very much. There was a predictable countdown in adversary activity targeting these particular types of vendors. Again, that's only 2 of 18. So there's more data that needs to be collected and analyzed to help validate this. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is if your defenders are seeing this, that is a signal of escalation. It may be worth something looking into. All right, so as an intelligence officer, intel is only good if you act on it or change decisions or help leaders make decisions. So broke this down in, what is the activity or behavior that you see? What does it mean and what to do? And so I won't go all the way through each step of this, but what I would highlight is if look at F. If you have a sustained surge in session-based activity, that's unusual behavior. That's part of that countdown that occurs. That's part of that volume of session-based IPs. And so that is at that last moment in which you probably want to begin to significantly act and investigate the potential impact of a vulnerability that could be targeted. The other thing I would highlight is we just released a report on Monday called 10 Days Before Zero, How Activity Surges Precede Vulnerability Disclosures. What I showed you here is just a taste of that. This report goes further into case studies. It goes into infrastructure analysis as well, and also the methodology. So if you have questions about our statistical methodology, that report can help provide that to you. If you're unable to locate it, feel free to reach out to me. We'll make sure that you get a copy of it. But it goes into much more greater depth than what I shared with you today. So what I'll leave you with is, at GreyNoise, again, we're employing a honeypot sensor network across the globe, 5,000 sensors in over 80 countries. We are collecting malicious cyber activity targeting edge infrastructure in real time. And based off of our primary collect data, we are confident that we've begun to identify the conditions prior to CVE being disclosed. We're not predicting the CVE. What we're saying is the conditions are being met for a vulnerability to be disclosed in the future, 3 weeks, 6 weeks in the future. And that's a repeatable signal. The signal is statistically significant, and because of that, it can be used as a decision support tool for early warning. So, if any questions, thank you for your time.